Hey everyone, so today I wanted to do a breakdown of how I created this shot. I had a lot of fun exploring how to add story elements into the scene, and I even ended up changing the vibe of the whole shot midway, and the final result turned out to be better than I expected it would. So without wasting too much of your time, let's just get into it. Let's start with sculpting the hill that our ruins are gonna sit upon. I'm gonna take this cube and I'll subdivide it quite a bit. Then in sculpt mode, you can turn on dynamic topology and you can start sculpting. I use a human mannequin for scale reference, and after you're satisfied with your sculpt, we will start creating the ruins. Now there are multiple ways you can go about doing something like this. You can just buy an asset pack that you can use, or you can create modular pieces yourself that you can use to build giant castles. But for ruins like these, I'm gonna go with a third option where I just create singular pieces of mesh that I'm gonna sculpt. This is probably the least efficient way to do something like this, but for me it generally gives me the best results because you're personalizing these assets to your scene and they seem like individual unique pieces because you're not reusing the same asset over and over again. And since this is an environment for a CG scene, you don't have to worry about poly count that much. And here, as you can see, I'm using very basic techniques and just extruding cubes to create a block out of the mesh. Later, we're gonna do a lot of detailing on top of these objects. I can also give you guys a very handy tip I use to create a lot of circular objects, and that is using the simple deform modifier. You can switch it to bend and add a lot of loops inside of it. You can also add an array modifier, so you can increase the count. I find it to be the most intuitive way to deal with circular objects, and since it's a non-destructive process, you can change the amount of bend and its length pretty easily. I want the ruins to have more flow, more of a dome structure. To do that, I'm gonna use a lot of booleans to cut into walls to create a more interesting shape, put a displace modifier onto these spheres, and I'm using them as booleans onto these objects. And after putting the displace modifier, you can see we can create more interesting shape that still feel realistic, creating some cylindrical shapes to give more variety. Now let's take our scene from this to this. Also, if you guys are interested in more in-depth breakdowns, which are much longer, I have started posting some fun tutorials on my Patreon. The first one is already up, the second one is in the works, where I'm trying to actually create a giant mega structure, and I'm going to do an in-depth breakdown of that. I also provide all the scenes and the assets that I create in the videos on my Patreon, so if you guys are interested in that, I recommend you check it out. We're going to first start with lighting. I put down a sun, and I'm going to make the sun angle pretty soft, and also make it cast shadows from the back to get a more dramatic look. Then I'm gonna bring in these mountains I created in World Creator. If you want to get access to these, they're available on my Patreon. The shapes also help bring the composition together. Now let's bring in an HDRI. I bring in this HDRI that I use in most of my scenes. I like to tweak it a little bit. I use the hue saturation node to change the tone, as the shadows here were quite blue. Now let's create some cloud shadows using light blockers. I'm gonna create a big plane, making sure that it casts shadow on most of the ruins, and I'm gonna create a noise texture using a color ramp and plug that into the alpha. That will help create holes inside of the mesh, and now you can play around with the scale to get a look that I'm happy with. You can also scale them down and duplicate them to put multiple of them. Then using some cubes as booleans, I'm gonna create some window holes. You don't just have to stick with the cubes, you can use the sphere that we created to break off bigger chunks from the mesh. Now we get to, in my opinion, most fun part of the process, which is sculpting out the main castle. I really love turning on dynamic topology and just sculpting away for hours, honestly. Like, I probably spent 2 hours in this whole sculpt, just giving nice little details. This process is just very fun. Like, you can just put on some nice music and get lost in just sculpting. Here I also sculpt out the base mesh further, creating some paths, creating some rocky bits. Then I start sculpting out the foreground using the same process, and I am pretty pleased with the result. The ruins look very organic. Using proportional editing, I push down this side of the mesh, create a lake. Also using proportional editing, I push down certain parts so that the lake is a little more visible. Give a very simple texture to the lake, just low roughness, high metallic, and just a little blue tone. I also tweak the shadows a bit more. I want more shadow in the foreground so that the viewer's eyes go towards the main ruins first. Now let's do some texturing. Firstly, for the ground and the background mountains, I bring in a grass PBR shader. I use a lot of Quixel Bridge textures for this. I also got some comments of people asking how I import stuff pretty seamlessly even though the plugin for Megascans is broken. I found an add-on for free on GitHub that fixes this issue. I put a link to it for free on my Patreon, so you can just go and get it. Then I bring in a stone texture for the walls, but after I tile it, it just doesn't look that good. So I bring in a different texture, and using an image texture of 2K size, we're gonna blend them together. And then you can jump into texture paint mode and paint away. I like to import a brush as well to just get nicer variation while I paint. Now we're gonna do more texture stacking on top of this to get better results. You can press Ctrl G to group these together. so that you don't have a spaghetti of nodes. Then you can just copy over the same node and change its light values so that now it's a little more brighter, and then you can create a new mask and paint that. And as always, I use the Blenderesse smudge generator nodes that he put on his Gumroad. I'll link them on my description that you can get. They are just very nice to get quick ambient occlusion based masking. You can tweak a lot of the values in here, and using that as the factor and making my color of the texture very dark, you can get nice grunge on your castle. I repeat the same process with all of the meshes, and after a while I get this result, and I'm pretty happy with how it looks. Using the same thing, I create a mask for the path. Here I'm trying to tweak my lighting. I like to use a black body node plugged into the color of my sun so I can use physically correct values for my lights. Doing this kind of just iteration to see what looks good and constantly trying to make changes to your render is always good. I also put in some new area lights and also give them a more warm tone so I can light up areas that are in the dark which I want to be in focus, and I can also use them to create some rim lights. And they make a considerable difference, as you can see. They can end up aiding the realism of your scene than taking away from it if you do it right. And in the end, I stick with a value of 6000 Kelvin for my black body node. I am liking the way the scene is coming along so far. For foliage, I use the free Polyhaven assets that are provided on their website. I find this grass to be very well optimized for scattering in larger areas. I'm sure there's better grass to scatter, but I feel like this is the perfect balance between realism and also optimization. And for scattering, you can use a lot of tools. I recommend, if you don't want to spend a lot of money, try out Grasswald. They have an extensive library of high quality free 3D foliage assets and also a free add-on that you can use to scatter them. I use Geoscatter because I bought it on a sale and it just works perfectly for my needs, but you don't have to spend that much money on a scattering asset in my opinion. After doing a very simple scatter of the grass, I want to try out some displacement for the foreground. I feel the ground looks very flat and giving it some extra detail could help with the scene's realism. So I plug in a displacement texture and start with the subdivision surface modifier to see how it displaces. And yeah, my scene crashed. And that is because my ground plane was way too huge, and subdivision on something like that, especially adaptive subdivision, is a nightmare. So I try isolating the foreground and applying the adaptive subdivision again, and this time it works, but it's slow. I'll try to figure out a better alternative to this in a little bit. I jump back into Megascans to get some nice rocks that I want to put around the castle. The add-on comes in really handy here to import these assets because they just come in with the textures applied. After being done with the rocks, I tweaked the sculpt of the small hill. I want the path to not be super dug into the ground. I want it to be at a similar level to the rest of the hill. Now I'll also show you something that I do to get fluffier grass, and that is creating a separate layer for a higher scaled grass. So you scatter one type of grass with low scale and higher density, and then a second layer on top with higher scale and lower density. That gives you variation, but also gives you this very nice fluffy feeling to your grass. Let's also do some volume scatter. Volumes are a really nice way to make your assets blend into your scene much better, because volumes kind of tone down a lot of vibrancy from your scene, which mimics real life, as when things fade into the background, they become less saturated. Another thing I like to do is I create a plane and subdivide it quite a bit and put my grass scatter on that plane, and using a shrink wrap I project that plane onto the ground, and you can just stick this anywhere where you feel like you want higher density grass. I jump back into Grasswald to grab some high quality assets that I want to scatter further on the ground. Then, after selecting things I like, I'm going to create a new scatter layer for them and scatter them on the ground. Now let's talk about the character. I used a pre-made asset I found on Sketchfab, and I found a separate sword asset that I attached to it. Then I posed it using the rig that it came with to make it look like it was more of a defeated knight who was walking back to the ruins where he lives. So I import him back into our main scene. Now I want to do some cloth. I want to put a torn cape on the back to make it look like he's coming from a battle where he lost. To achieve that, I tried using the Blender cloth sim where I subdivided the plane quite a lot, created a pin group in the vertex shader, and then using that I let the cloth fall onto the mesh. I obviously applied collision to the mesh, but yeah, the Blender cloth sim just did not work out at all for a while. Like, I messed around with it probably for like 30 minutes and it just was not working. And yeah, I gave up. And I went back to Marvelous Designer and I created this cape from it, and it took me like 2 minutes. Now to make the cloth look torn, I create a new mask texture that I paint out, and now I'm gonna mix this with the image of a cloth texture. I'm gonna mix them together in color burn mode and set the factor to pretty high and plug that into the alpha. Now when you paint, you'll see that you have little threads poking out. I don't wanna like do hyper realistic simulation for something like this because it's a very small detail which is not gonna be visible. I just wanna do something simple that works. And putting the character in really is bringing the scene to life. After this point, I went to bed, and after waking up the next day, I was not happy with the scene, honestly. So I decided to switch up the look. I decided to make it a night scene instead, because I usually prefer those kind of moody scenes anyways. I put in a principled volume instead and make it much more dense and make it a little more grayish. I also start tweaking the area lights that I put. I make them very bluish in tone and turn their strength up a little more. And now it looks like a night scene. I am turning up the temperature and the black body node for my sun as well by quite a lot. And now it looks like a night scene. I'm gonna tweak that a little more as we go on, but I'm pretty satisfied with the change. I decide to do another quick pass of optimizing the foliage and making it scatter more naturally. At this point, I just sit back and just look at the scene for a minute and try to identify what I want to add further, and I realize some light god rays would be something cool. So I start making a shader for that. It's actually pretty simple to fake god rays using volumes. I go into the material editor and start by creating a gradient texture. In the gradients texture, I set it to spherical and press Ctrl T to bring out the mapping nodes if you have the node wrangler add-on turned on, and I start messing around with the location and the rotation. I figured out that the location of -1 each and then just turning up the scale can give you the sphere at the center. And if you plug that into your volume shader, you will see that you have a very bright god ray. Now you can plug in an emission texture in the middle, which allows you to tweak the color and the strength. And now you can turn it to very low, so it's very dim and just slightly visible. And I place 2 of them on top of the castle ruins. And I kind of like the look. I'll tweak them down a little more though. I also decided to change up the sky. The previous sky looked a little too dull. I bring this more dynamic sky image that I'm going to plug in a hue saturation and a multiply node, which allow me to mess with the colors better. And you'll already see that the streaks in the middle of the image that the sky brings just help give the image much more character. I also decided to bring in these VDBs that I use in a lot of my scenes. I have a basic cloud material on it that I found from Samuel Kruger. His channel is amazing. I would recommend you guys check it out. And I placed them in a lot of areas which also help guide the composition and improve the image. I also put some in the foreground with lower intensity, so just the foreground also looks a little more misty. And I am about to complete the image. I just start tweaking some random stuff like improving the foliage scatter and stuff like that, just messing around with the lights. I also brought in some optimized trees that are available on my Patreon if you're interested. And I even try to go to the compositor to just finalize it. But I just felt something was missing. And I thought for a while on what should I change, and I realized it was story. A lot of my scenes are about large environments that look pretty, but I feel like I don't focus that much on story. But since this time I was having a character and it was trying to tell a little bit of a story, but it was just not enough to convey what was happening, I decided to push it further. And I decide, using the green pencil, I just try to draw it, and I decide to just put a lantern which has strong yellow light, so that's also complementary, so it'll help create a better composition, and create a door which signifies that this is where the character is going towards, so it's more definitive instead of just, yeah, he's probably heading towards there. So I hop back into Sketchfab and I found this really nice looking lantern model that I download, and I'm gonna stick it here. I create a basic cylinder as a nail that it's hung on top of. And I create a point light that is very bright and has a pretty large radius, and I'm gonna give it a black body node, and I'm gonna keep it at about 3000 so it looks pretty warm. Then I'm gonna use a boolean with this cube that I beveled on the top, and using that boolean I'm gonna stick in another door that I found on Sketchfab, and that already improved the scene so much. I also decided to push it even further. I want to create these banners that are hanging from the top there, which signify the clan or the group that he's part of. I subdivide it and I decide to put a cloth modifier on it so that it looks a little more natural drooping down. And then I hand model some wrinkles on top of it. Here I try to create a symbol of the organization that he's a part of on Photoshop. and then I bring it back into Blender, and then just using a color ramp to mask out the lighter and darker bits, I create a mask that allows me to change the color of the red and the yellow bits. It's just nice that I have control on how rough and metallic I want the eye to look. I duplicate the same banner and decide to stick that on top as well. And now I'm far happier with the scene. And to add one last nice detail into the scene, I decided to create small bricks. I go into dynamic topology and sculpt them out a little, and then I just try to stick them everywhere so that they just catch lights and create a better silhouette. I just check on how they're coming along. And after I've placed them almost everywhere, really give a very nice silhouette. It makes sense that there would be some bricks or rocks kind of just sticking out. And now I finalize the render, go into the compositor, and in the compositor I do my usual thing of using a lens distortion node and a glare node. For the glare node, I set the threshold to 0.3 with high, and I just play with the mix factor, and for lens distortion I put it to 0.15 and very low dispersion. I do a little bit of color grading in DaVinci Resolve, and after that, this is the final result. Thank you guys a lot for watching, and if you have any feedback that you'd like to give, I'm very open to hearing it in the comments, and maybe give the video a like and a subscribe. And if you'd like to support my channel, maybe check out the Patreon. And see you guys in the next video.